Thank you, Marco and Fabrizio and Davide, all the organizers, for inviting me and everybody for being here. Um, Let me see if I can share my slides. Okay, hopefully you see them. Tell me if you don't. Um, this is a paper that attempts to both summarize, how far we've gotten in understanding neural representation and also push the debate forward in a way that I think gives us the tools for solving a whole bunch of long-standing problems at the foundation of the philosophy of neuroscience, but also the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of cognitive science. I don't really distinguish between philosophy of cognitive science and philosophy of neuroscience, but um, some people do. And this paper is also a contribution to why we shouldn't really distinguish between the two. So some of you, if you've been around a bit, might remember there's a debate that started in the around the 1970s, late 70s, and really raged in the 80s about the nature of mental representation and whether it can be naturalized. And various accounts were proposed about how to naturalize representations. And for a long time, this debate really was not connected with neuroscience much. Then people like the Churchlands and others did try to connect it with neuroscience, um, but to a degree that literature more connected to neuroscience stayed kind of disjointed from the mainstream. The mainstream, I mean people like Millikan and Fodor and Dennett and Dretsky. Um, but I think that now we can reach an understanding of how thinking carefully about neural representation itself um, can lead to solving all these difficult problems about the nature of representation, mental representation, and as well as neural, because mental representations are ultimately realized by neural representations. Um, and there's another large theme that is present in this paper, and it's about the debate between computational and representational approaches to cognition versus the so-called 4EA approaches, situated approaches, embodied, extended, and active, um, maybe, um, yeah, embodied, embedded, extended, inactive, and effective. And a lot of people seem to think that those two are opposite. Um, Whereas, there are at least a few leading scholars, people like Andy Clark and Marcin Milkowski, who have already pointed out for years that the two approaches are compatible. But what I'm going to argue today is that they're not just compatible. Um, Rather, they're more intertwined than anybody suspected before. And specifically, it's by thinking about the embeddedness and embodiment, an active aspect and even effective aspect of representation itself, that we can solve these problems, these problems about the nature of representation. So, so contrary to what some people think, situating cognition or situated the neurocognitive system instead of being a alternative to computation representation, it's what provides a finally a sound account of the nature of neural computation and representation in biological systems. Okay, so that was just the preamble. Here, I'm not alone here, so I just want to acknowledge that the paper itself is forthcoming in Frontiers in Neurorobotics, um, but it also builds on recent work by a whole bunch of people. Here are the main ones. I listed them there. Of course, they're also listing the bibliography of the paper itself, and also the paper builds on my book. That the cover is there. Marco mentioned it. All right, so the main thesis is that neural computation and representation requires situatedness. And by situatedness, I mean embodiment, embeddedness, inactive aspect of cognition, as well as some basic notion of affect. Okay, so I forgot the affect part in this slide, but it should be there. So neurocognitive systems that have these features, and where the inactive aspect is cashed out here as dynamical, coupling with the environment and using feedback from the interaction to shape the representations and computations themselves. So if you've got these features, they help us explain how the system can construct these neural representations with original semantic content. I'll say in a second what that means. These neural vehicles are automatically coordinated with the content. Such content is causally efficacious, is determinate enough for the system's purposes, represents the distal stimulus, and can misrepresent. These 6 are some of the most difficult problems, in the theory of representation. I will omit 4 through 6. I will just focus on 1, 2, and 3. In some respects, those are kind of the hardest. But another couple of caveats. One is, it's a huge topic. The paper, really covers a lot of ground, and I'm not going to cover the whole paper here. So even the paper itself is really insufficient to really do justice to these topics. This talk is going to be just kind of a tease, a tease for you to maybe try to go and look at the paper itself for more information. I apologize for being a little sleep deprived. I had a rough night. I injured myself yesterday, so I was a bit in pain last night. So, but we'll get through this. So I will explain these problems and how I propose to solve them. But I also don't want to give the impression that this is totally new solutions. In many ways, these built on, what I'm proposing builds on informational tedial semantics, which is an account that goes back to especially Karen Neander, but in some respects also Ruth Millikan and Fred Dretske. Well, actually, Fred Dretske is equally important, at least as important as Karen Neander. But Karen Neander has a recent book from 2000, maybe 17, where she gives her own version. And what I'm saying is, there's an element of embodiment and embeddedness that's already in standard informational tedial semantics. But if we go even further than that, we can really solve all these problems. Okay. So problem 1, original content. Okay, this is a distinction that goes back to, probably John Searle and John Hoagland, but that the same string of letters or sounds, like burro, can mean different things in different languages. What this goes to show is that this kind of semantic content is derivative. It depends on something other than the representation itself. And specifically, in this case, it depends on the speakers of the language, what language do they speak and how do they, quote unquote, interpret these letters, the string of letters or the string of sounds. And, the standard mainstream story is that this derivative kind of content derives from the content of the representations that the speakers manipulate in processing public language. But if those representations are to really explain the content of symbols like the word burro, which have derivative content, the representations themselves have to have original content, non-derivative content that doesn't require further interpreters somewhere else that interpret the meaning of these symbols in the head, so to speak, these representations. So how can neural representations acquire original content? That's the problem. Okay. And informational tedial semantics does do some work towards answering this question, but we can go even further. Okay. And how are we going to go further? Well, let's look at the other two main problems. The coordination between vehicles and content. This is a little less known than the other two. But so you consider an automatic Italian-English translator. You know, it should be able to transform certain kinds of sentences into others, but not the other way around. So the operation, of say translation, needs to match the content of the symbols, and this doesn't require translation either. It's any kind of manipulation of representations for it to really fulfill the promise of a representational explanation. It needs to be done in such a way that the processing of the vehicles matches the content of the vehicles, that the vehicles are manipulated in a way that respects or matches the semantic content that they have. And in ordinary computers that we build, that we program, it's the human programmers and users that ensure this match, that that the processing, the computations match the content of the representations. But who does that for the brain or the neurosystem or neurocognitive system? How can a kind of a self-organizing system like a neurocognitive system match the computational operations performed on the vehicles to the content of the vehicles? If it worked like in a computer, then it would be the system would have to have access to both of these things independently. Both the vehicles and the content, to make sure that the vehicles are processed in a way that matches the content. But then that requires that there's already something else that has access to the contents, and so it's not the neurocognitive system itself that can do that. So we risk running into another vicious circle, and I don't know that anybody has really tried to solve this problem explicitly. And the third problem, this one has been debated a lot. It's the problem of the causal efficacy of content. So in a computer, in an ordinary computer, content doesn't actually cause anything. The computation proceeds regardless. I'm talking about external semantics. When like a symbol in a computer means something outside of the computer. I'm not talking about the meaning of, say, like the symbol for addition inside the computer. Yeah, so certainly there's an internal semantics for computational operations, and that's fine. But if you're trying to process, your ordinary symbols in a computer, the data especially can refer to anything in the world. It can refer to trees and flowers and dogs. But that fact, that semantic fact, is not causally efficacious within the computer. What really does the causing in the computer is the vehicle itself. And then, if all goes well, this process matches the content of the vehicles, but it's not the content itself that causes anything. So there's a lot of literature on this question. Then how does this work for the mind or the brain? Are contents, really inert in brains like they are in a computer? And if so, doesn't this undermine the whole enterprise of representational explanation? But otherwise, we'd really need a story for how content could be really playing a causal role. Okay. All right. So these are the problems. To get to the solution, first I'm going to introduce the thesis again. Basically, it's that if a system has these features, that it's embodied, embedded, and active and effective, then it can build its own semantic content together with the computations that go with it. And that's why the content and the computations are coordinated. And the content, the vehicles, and the computations over the vehicles are all coordinated. And that's also why content is causally efficacious. And there's a lot to say and I will not be able to say it all here, but I will give you the flavor. Okay. So first important piece of background is the notion of structural representation. This is a notion that I think has become, by a pretty wide consensus, the notion that is relevant here. There's like slight variations in how it's defined. Here's one way to define it that I think works fine for our purposes. It's a system of internal states that have a certain function or a series of functions. Function one is to be partially isomorphic to a target. The target is what the representation is supposed to represent. They carry out natural semantic information about the targets, meaning that if the state occurs, it raises the probability that what it represents or what it purports to represent occurs. 3, it's activated by signals from the target. 4, it can be decoupled from the target. That means that it can be activated even if the target is not directly impinging on the system. It's not immediately perceivable, or there's no sensory data coming from the target. So occlusion is a good example. We can still represent. You can still represent me as having a whole body even if you only see my face. The representation of the rest of the body is decoupled from the target. You're not perceiving my feet right now, but you can still represent them. That's the idea of decoupling. And then it can guide behavior with respect to the target. And Marco Facchini, who's a commentator today, has an interesting recent paper arguing that ultimately structural representations don't really fulfill the job description challenge for representation. And maybe he'll have something to say later about all of this, but I want to point out that I'm not just arguing that any structural representation is going to do the job of neural representations. Rather, I am starting with structural representation, and then I'm going to say, well, neural representation are structural representations, but are also a very special type of structural representation. And one of the things that's special about it is that they don't just they're not just simply partially isomorphic to the target in a static way, but in a dynamic way, in a dynamical way. So what that means is that they are, at least many of them, many neural representations are structural representations that evolve to simulate the evolution of the target. So the brain, the nervous system, is constantly trying to anticipate what is going to happen in the environment, in the body and the environment, and then as a result of what the body does to the environment and to itself. So these simulations are constantly built and maintained. They're used to guide behavior, and then information or feedback from the body and the environment, as well as from the system itself, is used to update the simulation. These internal structural representations. So this is one additional constraint on the story. It's that these are a special type of structural representations. And another one is that the system learns, and it's constantly, learning to, improve these simulations. And I will talk more about learning in a minute and the type of learning that's involved here. And let's take it from what we understand about artificial neural networks. So artificial neural networks learn, at least that's how they're usually described. And there's a whole bunch of paradigms for different types of learning. I don't want to get into too many details, but first there's supervised learning, where the network is given labels, or at least direct information about ways in which it's departing from the correct mapping or the correct output in processing its inputs. That is not really something that can realistically happen in neurocognitive systems, certainly not the way it works in AI. Typically these days, For supervised learning networks, people use these huge databases of already labeled data. And, brains don't come into the world receiving labeled data. So the other paradigm that's often thought to be enough for understanding the brain by default is unsupervised learning, where a neural network extracts patterns from the data without any information about how to do it right or how to do it wrong. It works with some tasks, if the network is trying to extract certain patterns in a data set, but it doesn't work for all tasks. And also, certainly the brain has access to other types of information than just the data. And I'll get to that in a second. So there's one type of unsupervised learning called self-supervised learning, in which the network extracts supervisory signals from the data. And the main way to do that is to, once you start getting, a series of data, is to try to start extracting a pattern and predicting how the pattern is going to continue, and then using discrepancies between your prediction and how the data evolve to learn better ways of predicting data. So, AI, writing tools where they complete your sentence, or they even complete your paragraph, or you can start a paragraph and they complete a whole paragraph, or they can write a whole essay nowadays. They're tools of this sort. They're trained this way. They are self-supervised learning tools. They try to predict on the basis of large data sets how to continue a certain sentence or how to continue a certain paragraph. Now, this is something that the brain can do and presumably does do. And there's another technique that's becoming increasingly influential, and that's reinforcement learning, where there's a reward signal. This is not quite a standard supervised learning protocol because there's no one telling the network this is wrong and this is how to correct yourself, or this is the correct result and this is what you need to get. Instead, the way the system is trained is by just basically saying, this output is on the right track, or this output is on the wrong track. And then it's up to the network to kind of use that feedback to reorganize itself to try to select better outcomes next time. And this is certainly something that happens, something like this happens in neurocognitive systems, and it presumably contributes to learning in neurocognitive systems. And it is a step, these ways of learning, insofar as they apply to the brain, they shape both the representation and at the same time the operations performed on them. This is very different from the way ordinary computers work. And it's already, it already exists in artificial neural networks. So I want to stress that, because it's not usually appreciated, even in the literature on representation, that as a neural network organizes itself, no matter exactly what the learning technique is, it builds both the internal representations that are going to be used later on to process the signals, as well as the operations to be performed on them. Again, there's another kind of divide there. Some networks can be partially organized at the beginning in a certain way that's pre-specified, as if they had like innate structure. Others are more of a blank slate. They're even in some cases are completely random at the beginning, and then they acquire a way of processing inputs on the basis of internal representations to get certain outputs and solve certain tasks. But so the operations, especially all these internal sequence of operations inside the network, are acquired together with the representations in the hidden layers of the network. So this is pretty important, and it will give us a step towards original semantic content and the causal efficacy of content, but we're not there yet. So how do we get there? Well, I'm going to introduce this term taken from pedagogy, active learning. So in pedagogy, people call active learning methods where students are required to engage actively with the material. They have to discuss it, they have to write about it, they have to um, debate it, and so forth, or do exercises with it, not just listen to the teacher. Okay, and I'm kind of appropriating this term for the type of learning that happens in neurocognitive systems. Just to have a term, so that we don't confuse it with any of these other terms that are from AI. And what's peculiar to learning in neurocognitive systems, I would claim, is the use of real-time feedback from the system itself, the body and the environment, while the system acts in the world. And and as many kind of inactivists have emphasized, the system is always acting in the world, even if it's just by moving their, its eyes, the human cognizer, the human eyes don't stand still. And by not standing still, they vary the direction from which, visual input is entering the system. And that makes a difference to how the system works and what it can learn. So there are two processes at once: the computation that's being performed on the current input and internal states, but also the process of learning by which the networks themselves are modified and better. They become better at solving tasks in the future. So some of the sources of learning that are exploitable by the brain include the timing and frequency of these signals, the channels through which signals arrive. Is it auditory? Is it visual? Is it olfactory? The correlations between different portions of the signal. This is what can be used for self-supervised learning. And also, crucially, the dependencies between inputs, internal states, and outputs. And these dependencies are going to be different depending on whether the output is output of the system itself, of the neurocognitive system itself. So its own outputs can be kind of redirected internally as feedback to kind of anticipate what the system is about to do and how the world is about to change. Or there's feedback through the body. How's the body changing at any given time? And then there's feedback through the environment. How is the environment changing at any given time? And by comparing and using these different types of dependencies, the neurocognitive system can learn in a way that goes beyond your typical neural network, artificial neural network, because artificial neural networks are typically, are not embodied and they're not embedded in the same way that a brain is. Obviously, there's embedded robotics, there's embedded, and so there's an element of embodiment and embeddedness there, but we still don't fully understand how brains themselves learn through a body into an environment. And the best proof that I know of that is that some of the most advanced robotic applications using neural networks, for example, there's a robot that's able to solve the Rubik cube with one hand, and it's a real Rubik cube manipulated by a single robotic hand. So this robot is not just intelligent enough to solve the Rubik cube most of the time. Now, it doesn't always solve it, but enough. But it also is very dexterous. It can do it with just one hand. So that's impressive. But they train these networks in an artificial environment, because the real environment has way too many degrees of freedom, and they don't know how to efficiently learn in a real environment. So they manage to train these networks using an artificial environment, and then these networks and the robot are good enough that this learning can transfer to the real world. But my point is just that nobody knows exactly how brains manage to learn in the real environment with all its degrees of freedom. Okay, so that just to say that there's something still not understood and it presumably quite interesting that allows brains to learn through a body in an environment, and this is what I'm referring to as active learning. Okay, what I point out is that active learning requires embodiment. The sensors and effectors of the body and the feedback loop between the system and its body are needed to learn that the system has a body and how it can simulate and control it. So in addition, it requires embeddedness because the environment is not only where the information to be learned is, but again, there's a feedback loop between the system and its environment, and it's needed to distinguish, for the system to be able to distinguish between what's its own body and what the environment is. It requires an action. An action is another one of these terms that's been defined in a million ways. I'm going to define an action for present purposes as a mutual determination between the system and its environment, as the system acts in the environment in real time. And, there's a lot more to say about all of these things, but, I think this is a notion that's been around, it's been in the literature, and so I'm not making something up. And I do think that it illuminates one aspect of what I'm describing, specifically that as these internal simulations drive behavior, the system is always exploiting the interdependence of the input from the environment and the outputs from the system and the effect of the output of the system to drive learning. So there's this mutual determination. The system is constantly affecting the environment, and the environment is constantly affecting the way that the system learns how to process all of this, and therefore how it builds its own computational operations at the same time that it builds the representations. And finally, it requires affect, because reward signals are a very basic type of affect. They provide the system with information about whether things are going in the right direction or the wrong direction. Clearly, brains, neurocognitive systems have a much more complex type of reward signals than artificial neural networks. Artificial AI typically has just one type of reward signal. It's like, is it good or is it bad? Whereas brains have all kinds of internal signals that can be used to reinforce or extinguish behaviors. There's a whole dopamine reward system that's the best known, but there's a whole bunch of others. Okay, so briefly, how does situatedness solve the problem of original content? Well, it does because content itself basically is just, in my account, and this is a kind of a different kind of teleosemantics than the typical one. So typically neurosemantics explains content in terms of selection history of the system, what the system was selected to do, either by evolution or by learning itself. But I actually think that there's a better way to formulate teleosemantics, and that is in terms of contributions of the relevant trait of the system. In this case, it's these internal states to the goals of the system. And goals are defined as sort of, aspects of living systems that living systems need to pursue in order to continue to exist, such as survival and reproduction for at least some of the organisms, and there's others. Anyway, I talk about this in the book, but going back to original content. So original content, in my account, is a type of manifestation of the causal powers of the system, which is also a causal power in itself. So, so the system learns to form these internal states under appropriate circumstances, and when the system is working properly, these internal states are tracking and simulating certain other targets, external variables. So they're manifesting the powers of the system. And at the same time, because of how they're connected to the rest of the system, the kind of effectors, if you will, the motor system, they also can guide behavior. So they have the power to guide behavior. And the content itself is acquired through active learning, because it's this power to track targets that can guide behavior. And so this is constructed by the system itself as it undergoes this process of active learning. That's what makes it original content. It's constructed by the system itself. It also solves at the same time the coordination between the computations and the contents, because the computations themselves are learned by the system. It's not like there are the vehicles and their content is separate from the vehicles. The vehicles themselves, one aspect of the vehicle is how they're connected to the input system and the output system, so that they can guide behavior with regards to the targets. And therefore, the way the system processes the vehicles is matched to the content of the vehicles, because the content of the vehicles itself is a power that's constructed inside the system by the system via its learning process. And finally, the efficacy of content. Hopefully by now you see how this whole fits together. These are not really separate problems. They're really three aspects of the same problem. The content itself is causally efficacious because, again, it's just an aspect of the internal causal powers of the states of the system, which are constructed by the whole system itself through the process of learning, active learning. So, again, the system, as it engages with the environment through the body, it extracts the right invariants. It figures out how to, activate these internal states under the right circumstances, and then how to process them in the right way to guide behavior. So the content is just this aspect of the states, activating these internal states that track behavior is the same as causing the system to be guided by these internal states, and therefore we know it makes sense to say that the content itself is causally efficacious. So in conclusion, situated neurocognitive systems can construct neural representation with original semantic content. Their neural vehicles are automatically coordinated with their content. Such content is causally efficacious, and other standard problems in the theory of representations are also illuminated by this approach. I don't have time to get into that, but the paper does talk a little bit about it. So I invite you to take a look. Thank you.